Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, I'm going to show you how to program your Canon R8 like a boss. I'm pleased to announce the release of my Capture One and Lightroom presets, Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These are all available for purchase at my website. Go to kevindealphotography.com or check out a link in the description below. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So if you're watching this episode, chances are that you took advantage of those Black Friday deals, or perhaps Santa Claus put an R8 under the Christmas tree for you. Either way, congratulations, you got yourself an amazing camera. And I did a review of this camera, a full review, so if you want to see that, you can check it out in a link in the description below, or look at the card in the upper right corner of this screen, where you can see my thoughts on this camera. But today is a lesson. So for many of you, this is your first big boy or big girl full frame camera, and you've convinced yourself that this is going to be the camera that's going to push you into finally shooting in manual mode, or the subject of today's episode. It's going to convince you to program your camera to complement the way you like to shoot. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you haven't completely thought out what you like. No worries, we're going to get into all of that. Put a fresh battery in your R8 and have it in front of you, and be prepared to pause and rewind this video if you need to go over a step again. The point of this video is not to say that the way I program my R8 is the way to program an R8, but instead it's simply a way to program an R8, and maybe the way I program my R8 clicks with you and you're going to program yours the same way. But I do encourage you to take a step back, think about the genre you shoot, evaluate your workflow on your R8, and apply it to what you've learned in this video. It's very possible that over time your needs change, and therefore what you need to access on the camera will change as well. I also want to make a note that this video is going to be focused on photography, not videography. Videography custom button and dial assignments are different than photography, so I feel like they deserve their own video, which I may do at a later date. To begin, we should have a brief discussion about what makes a good camera setup. While I am a portrait photographer, this discussion is applicable to any style of photography. Today's episode is going to be centered around shooting in manual mode, and the reason I like to teach this lesson in manual mode is if you decide manual mode is not for you, these same principles apply. You just simply change the mode of your camera and perhaps reassign a dial. No big deal, but the point is, if you can do this in manual mode, you can do it in any mode. To begin, your camera has dials and buttons, and to assign something to a dial or a button, you need to know where to go. So press the menu button on your R8 and then press the orange or second to last icon, and then navigate to tab number 3. Here you will see custom buttons and custom dials. You are going to live in this area of the menu throughout this entire video, so get yourself used to navigating to this area of the camera. Stop this video and take a few minutes to click on and explore what you can reassign your dials and buttons to. There are literally dozens of potential parameters you can assign them to. To begin, I separate my camera into a primary, a secondary, and tertiary area. Primary is what I need to access the most. Secondary is what I need to access the second most, and tertiary is, you guessed it, what I need to access the least, but still access regularly. Let's start with the primary area, and I assign this to the 3 most important settings in all of photography, and that is my exposure triangle. Ergonomically speaking, my primary area needs to be completely controllable by my index finger and thumb. Ideally, I shouldn't have to pull my eye away from the viewfinder in order to make these adjustments. So, right behind your shutter release or trigger, you have a dial. This dial, by default, should be your shutter speed. If you're in manual mode, turning this dial and your shutter speed is not adjusting, navigate to the custom dial setting we talked about earlier in this video and reassign it to shutter speed. Now, we have one of our 3 exposure triangle settings assigned. If you're holding your camera properly, your thumb is likely resting on this dial. That's not by mistake. Canon put that dial there on purpose for you to regularly access. By default, in manual mode, this should be assigned to your aperture, and that's what I leave it at. If it's not assigned to your aperture, you can reassign it by once again going to the custom dials. A quick comment about the front and rear dials. Maybe you come over from the world of Nikon where the front and rear dial have reverse assignments from Canon. On Nikon, the front dial is aperture and the rear dial is shutter speed. Or maybe you just think that makes more sense to you. Once again, go to the custom dials area and here you can flip the assignment of these dials if that's what you want to do. Great, but what about the third part of the exposure triangle, ISO? This is where we are going to get into the reassignment of buttons. Canon, by default, puts this dedicated recording button on your camera when you're in photography mode. By default, if you're shooting still photos, you can immediately start recording video by pushing the red button. This is super convenient, but how often do you actually find yourself needing to do this? In my 2 decades of shooting photography, I've really only needed to do this a handful of times. So I personally don't feel like this necessitates a dedicated button while in photography mode, especially on my R8. If I simply toggle the camera icon to the video icon, then press the dedicated red button, it'll immediately start recording video. I'd rather add the extra step of having to toggle to video mode if it means I'm going to gain an extra button assignment while in photography mode. So now that I have this fresh button to be reassigned, what do I reassign it to? ISO. As I said earlier, I want my exposure triangle to be in the same area of real estate on my camera so I don't ever have to pull my eye off the viewfinder. By reassigning this record button to ISO, I achieved that. Now I simply press this record button and I can now either use the front or rear command dial to scroll through my ISO settings. And to do this, once again, you go to the orange icon, tab 3, and then select Customize Buttons and scroll to the video icon. From there, you can reassign this button to ISO. That completes my exposure triangle. The last part of my primary part of the camera is the multi-function button, which I don't reassign. I leave this in its default assignment because here you can quickly access white balance, drive mode, and other commonly accessed parts of the camera. The second most important thing to me is autofocus. I shoot a genre of photography that greatly relies on autofocus, so being able to control the behavior of my autofocus is almost as important as my exposure triangle. This is why I dedicate the secondary area of my camera to autofocus. Just like my primary area, I want my secondary area to be buttons and dials I can easily feel without taking my eye off the viewfinder. So I reassign these 3 buttons right here. If you're a back button focuser, the AF on button will engage your camera's focus, but so does the half press of the shutter. I used to be big on back button focus, but over the years I've moved away from it. So if you're a back button focuser, just leave this in its default setting. Personally, I've reassigned this to AF stop if I want to lock in my focus. The upper button that you see right here, I reassign between one shot and servo autofocus. I have some subjects that are still and I have other subjects that like to move. Having a dedicated button that changes the autofocus behavior is important to me. So I have this button toggle between one shot and servo. Because I'm a portrait photographer, I reassign the button below that to eye AF because when shooting portraits, the eye is usually your primary focal point. I've been on the RF mount since it came out in 2018, and all of my RF lenses have this cool assignable control ring. After much thought, I've been rolling for the past half decade with this ring assigned to my autofocus area, and I've been pretty happy with it. Once again, I have a perimeter that controls the behavior of my autofocus. So for my secondary area, I control autofocus, and all I have to do is move my thumb over to the right, or simply grab the control ring on my lens and I have complete control over my autofocus, all without having to pull my eye off the viewfinder. Now to the tertiary area, and I find this area can vary the most depending on what's important to you. This is the area where you may most likely disagree with my choices and decide to reassign your own. That's a good thing. That's the point of customization, and that's the point of this video. This is where I encourage you to have a strong opinion based on your self-evaluation and what's important to you and your photography. For my up directional pad, I reassign this to white balance. It's true, I can access my white balance by pressing the multifunction button, but I access it a lot, so I decided to devote a dedicated button to these duties. For my left directional pad, I decided to stay on the theme of controlling autofocus behavior, but with a setting I don't need to access quite as much. Here I have assigned start, stop, whole area tracking. Tracking is something that I do often, so I felt the need to assign a button to it. For the right directional pad, I have that assigned to set the AF point to the center. This is a good opportunity to talk about touch and drag, which is another cool assignable parameter in your camera. Most of the time, Canon's autofocus is spot on, but sometimes it's not focusing on what I want it to focus on. Sometimes I want to override what the box is trying to stick to. With my eye up to the viewfinder, I like doing this without having to remove my eye. So by enabling touch and drag, I can simply drag my thumb across the screen. It'll move my focus box where I tell it to go. I personally have this setting put on the lower right quadrant of the screen, and I find that this works quite well. To assign touch and drag, go to the AF, which is the purplish pinkish icon. And then enable touch and drag. Then scroll down to the active touch area. That's where I assign it to the bottom right. You can assign it to whatever you want. When I want to reset my touch and drag to the center, I simply press my newly assigned right directional pad, and that box snaps back to the center. I find these settings work quite well together. For the bottom button, I have that assigned to subject to detect, so I can quickly scroll between people, animals, and vehicles. The Q button in the middle, I leave it in its default setting because within that there are many more commonly accessed items like my picture style, anti-flicker, image quality, and more. Great, now that we've gotten through these three areas, we're done, right? Wrong. There's more. There's a fourth area you can access as well, your favorites or star icon. This is the green star area. It's the very last icon on the right. If you select configure, you can assign even more things you want to access quickly. I put format card, image quality, screen viewfinder display, and custom shooting mode. There are literally dozens of items you can assign, and you can create multiple tabs to assign items to. Speaking of custom shooting modes, when you've decided that your camera is set up in the way you want it to be set up to, you need to save your settings. If you don't have this assigned to your favorites like I do, you can access it by going to the yellow wrench, which is the third to last icon, and then go to tab number 5. You then select Register Settings, and from there you can assign it to one of your custom shooting modes, C1 or C2. You can enable or disable Auto Update Set. When this feature is enabled, the camera will automatically update the custom shooting mode with any changes that you've made to the settings while shooting. So, for example, if you have this enabled and you reassign the right directional pad to something new, anytime you recall that custom setting, it will recall it with that newly assigned right directional pad. If you disable this feature, it takes a snapshot of what everything was assigned to when you saved it. Then, if you reassign a bunch of stuff and hate it, you can always reload that custom shooting mode and it'll load the snapshot as you saved it. I personally have this enabled because when I shoot, I constantly turn my camera on and off, and I don't want my camera to go back to a snapshot. But you do whatever works for you. You can recall your C1 and C2 modes from your PASM dial. So there was quite a bit to go over in this video, but the point of this video was mainly to show you how to assign custom buttons and dials to your R8. At the end of the day, only you can decide which assignments make the most sense to you. That does it for today's episode. I hope each and every one of you got something out of today's episode, whether you're somebody who just got an R8 or you're curious about how I set mine up. Hopefully this video helped. Tell me about how you set up your R8 in the comments below. And if you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.